Aryna Sabalenka has never been one to hold back. She speaks her mind, dominates the court, and refuses to play politics. But there's one name that keeps slipping into her interviews, her press conferences, her social media, and it's not a rival legend. It's a name that shouldn't matter, yet somehow won't leave her lips. Eala. What could a young rising star possibly have done to rattle one of the sport's most formidable champions? The answer isn't what you think. For years, Aryna Sabalenka stood atop women's tennis like an empress. Her serve was a weapon. Her baseline game was relentless. Her confidence bordered on invincibility. When she walked onto a court, opponents didn't see a player. They saw a force of nature. Major titles followed, rankings climbed, sponsorships multiplied. The narrative was clear. Sabalenka was the future, the present, the inevitable. But something shifted in 2023 and beyond. Not in her wins, not in her statistics, in how she spoke about tennis itself. Sabalenka had always commanded interviews with authority. She'd discuss her opponents with the candor of someone who'd beaten most of them. She'd analyze the sport with the perspective of someone winning at the highest level. Yet somewhere along the way, her tone began changing. More defensive, more curious, more unsettled. Then came the emergence of Eala. Eala wasn't manufactured hype. She was raw talent wrapped in relentless work ethic. A young Filipina player who trained without the backing of tennis royalty, who fought through lower-ranked tournaments with a hunger that felt almost theatrical in its intensity. She wasn't threatening Sabalenka's titles, not yet, but she was threatening something far more dangerous, the narrative that age and experience guaranteed superiority. When Eala broke into conversations at major tournaments, when her name appeared alongside rising stars and future champions, something flickered across Sabalenka's face in interviews. Recognition, perhaps. Or anxiety. The kind of anxiety that only emerges when you realize the sport you've dominated is beginning to speak a language you didn't invent. Sabalenka had been anointed by a system that valued dominance above all else. Eala was building something different, a mythology of hunger. And in women's tennis, where narratives carry as much weight as rankings, mythology can be contagious. Was Sabalenka seeing her replacement in the mirror for the first time? By 2024, Sabalenka's championship resume was staggering, yet her public commentary had taken on an obsessive quality. In interviews after wins, she'd mention Eala. After losses, Eala's name would surface, not as an excuse, but as a reference point, a measure of generational shift. What made this unusual wasn't jealousy. Sabalenka had nothing to be jealous of. It was something more profound. Sabalenka was watching a player emerge who represented everything the new generation valued: authenticity, vulnerability, relentless hustle, without requiring the same institutional validation that had crowned Sabalenka. Eala gave interviews where she discussed mental struggles without packaging them for sponsors. She talked about losses as learning opportunities without the corporate polish. She existed in the sport without performing for the sport. And that terrified something deeper than competition. Sabalenka, trained in an era where champions built walls and spoke in measured confidence, was witnessing a younger generation tear down those walls and gain credibility through that very destruction. It wasn't about who could hit harder, it was about who could touch the audience's heart with brutal honesty. The dynamic festered beneath the surface. Sabalenka's interviews became more frequent mentions of Eala's potential, her trajectory, her special something. To casual observers, it looked like mentorship. To those paying attention, it looked like someone watching their entire framework for success become obsolete in real time. Then came the 2024 tournaments where their paths nearly crossed. Not on court, not yet, but in the cultural conversation. When Eala advanced in a tournament, media coverage suddenly shifted, not to dismiss Sabalenka's era, but to question whether it was truly the template for the future. Sabalenka felt that question in every press conference. She answered it in every interview, and she couldn't stop because stopping would mean accepting that her reign wasn't just challenged, it was being redefined. The most dangerous rivalry in sports isn't always the one happening on court. Sometimes it's the one happening in the minds of champions, watching their legacy get rewritten. What happened next was almost inevitable. Sabalenka began intentionally bringing Eala into conversations where Eala hadn't been mentioned. A journalist would ask about her future goals, and somehow Eala's name would surface. Another would inquire about the state of women's tennis, and Sabalenka would use it as an opportunity to discuss emerging talent, specifically Eala's. This wasn't strategic in a calculating sense. It was visceral, almost involuntary. Sabalenka had become trapped in a loop of self-analysis that kept circling back to one question. What does this younger player represent that I don't? The answer was uncomfortable. Eala represented possibility without precedent. She was building her legacy without following the blueprint. She was winning without being anointed. She was gaining respect not because the system had decided she was worth respecting, but because she had convinced an audience through sheer force of will and authentic struggle. Sabalenka's generation had earned respect through dominance and results. Eala's generation was earning it through narrative transparency and emotional intelligence. These weren't contradictory systems, they were incompatible ones, and Sabalenka, despite her championship rings, felt the incompatibility acutely. The public started noticing. Social media exploded with speculation. Was Sabalenka intimidated? Was she threatened? Was she secretly rooting for Eala? The truth was messier than any of these narratives. Sabalenka wasn't threatened by Eala's rankings. She was troubled by what Eala's rise represented about the evolution of the sport itself. Eala was proof that you didn't need to fit the mold to matter. You could challenge the system and gain power anyway. You could question conventions and still be celebrated. That was revolutionary in a sport that had always demanded conformity to its traditional power structures. And Sabalenka, despite being its reigning champion, found herself on the wrong side of that revolution. There was a moment, captured in an interview following a quarterfinal victory in Madrid, where Sabalenka's obsession crystallized into something approaching confession. Asked about her legacy, she pivoted directly to Eala. Not dismissively, not even critically, but with an intensity that made the journalist visibly uncomfortable. She spoke about Eala's potential with the authority of someone who'd studied it obsessively. She dissected Eala's game with the precision of a coach. She prophesied Eala's future with the certainty of someone who could see the generational shift happening in real time. The soundbite went viral, not because it was scandalous, but because it was real in a way that tennis narratives rarely allowed. Here was perhaps the sport's most dominant active champion speaking not about her own achievements, but about the player who would eventually overshadow them. There was dignity in it. There was also desperation. Eala, watching from afar, responded cautiously in her own interview. She thanked Sabalenka for the recognition, but deflected attempts to fuel a narrative of rivalry or succession. But the damage, or perhaps the blessing, had been done. The conversation was no longer about whether Eala could compete, it was about when. Sabalenka's constant references to Eala became a self-fulfilling prophecy. By speaking about Eala so frequently, so earnestly, she was essentially anointing her as the next generation's champion. The very thing she'd been anointed with was now being transferred, not through tournaments, but through the testimony of the outgoing era. This drove her to speak about Eala even more. It was as if she needed to vocalize the transition to make sense of it, to contextualize her own legacy within a larger narrative of generational succession. Somewhere in the spiral of interviews and constant references lay a truth that transcended tennis. Sabalenka wasn't speaking about Eala because she wanted to diminish her or promote her. She was speaking about her because Eala represented the answer to a question Sabalenka had been asking herself for years. Am I enough? Sabalenka had won everything the system could offer, but she'd also discovered something hollow about that system. It celebrated dominance, but discouraged vulnerability. It rewarded victories, but punished honesty. It built champions, but never quite let them be human. Eala, by contrast, had built something different. She'd created legitimacy through transparency. She'd earned respect by admitting struggle. She'd positioned herself as relatable while remaining exceptional, a combination Sabalenka's generation had been told was impossible. So Sabalenka kept talking about Eala not because she was threatened, but because she was fascinated, maybe even envious. Not of Eala's rankings or titles, those would come in time, but of her freedom to be something other than a champion. Eala could be scared, uncertain, hungry, and still be celebrated. That luxury hadn't existed for Sabalenka's generation. Champions were supposed to be invulnerable. The constant references to Eala became Sabalenka's way of processing her own disillusionment with a system that had elevated her but also imprisoned her. By promoting Eala, she was unconsciously advocating for a new model of tennis stardom, one that didn't require total emotional suppression, one that could sustain itself through authenticity rather than invincibility. Eala, for her part, began to understand this. She realized that Sabalenka wasn't her rival in the traditional sense. Sabalenka was her bridge, a champion from the old order helping to usher in the new one, not through defeat, but through recognition. As the 2024 season progressed, something shifted in how we understood the Sabalenka-Eala dynamic. It wasn't a rivalry waiting to happen, it was a conversation about the future of women's tennis itself. Sabalenka's constant invocation of Eala's name became less about anxiety and more about advocacy. When she spoke about Eala, she was essentially saying, "This is who matters now. This is the standard. This is the future. Accept it." It was the most gracious abdication of power that tennis had witnessed in decades, not through loss, but through choice. Sabalenka had decided, somewhere in those interviews where she couldn't stop talking about Eala, that her legacy wasn't measured by how long she could hold on to dominance. It was measured by how effectively she could pass the torch while it was still burning. Eala's rise, accelerated by Sabalenka's constant promotion, represented something revolutionary. A player who could compete at the highest level without performing a version of herself designed for public consumption. A champion who could exist authentically in a sport built on artifice. And Sabalenka, in her obsessive commentary, became the translator between worlds. Her insistence on discussing Eala wasn't a commentary on her own decline. It was a manifesto for how tennis needed to evolve. It was a champion saying, without saying it directly, the old rules don't apply anymore. The new guard isn't bound by what bound us. By late 2024, tournaments were being discussed not through the lens of Sabalenka's achievements alone, but through the possibility of Eala's ascension. The narrative had already shifted. The torch was already passing. Sabalenka had simply accelerated the process through her relentless, almost compulsive honesty about what she was witnessing. When historians look back at this era of women's tennis, they won't see it as the end of Sabalenka's reign. They'll see it as the moment when a declining champion chose authenticity over defensiveness, and in doing so, became more valuable than any title could make her. The question wasn't whether Sabalenka would be remembered. She would be. The question was how, and increasingly, the answer hinged on what she'd said about Eala, on how she'd narrated her own obsolescence with grace, intelligence, and what might have been the wisest move of her career, recognizing genius when it emerged and ensuring the world knew she saw it coming.